Welcome, everyone, to the C-Suite Sales and Marketing Perspectives podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. Today, we've got a really interesting conversation with Andy Stauffer. Now, Andy, you're not only the CEO and founder of Proofmap, but you tend to lead a life that a lot of us would like to. You recently spent 8 months traveling all around Asia with your girlfriend, I think fiance, who is now your wife. So you're recently married. Lots of great things happening in your life, and you've also founded Proofmap, and so you're pretty busy, but you've got a real point of view, especially with Proofmap. But I want to hear a little bit about what Proofmap is, but also we're going to talk today about the missed opportunity of not creating content at scale and what that means. But before we get into all that, I'd love to have you maybe expand a little bit more beyond what I did there about your background.
Yeah, sounds good. No, that's a fun intro. Let me see what I can do with that. So my name is Andy Stauffer. I am the founder of Proofmap. When you're the founder, you can just promote yourself to CEO at any time. So I've promoted myself to CEO now that we've actually had some traction here in the last couple of months. My background is really at just one company where I was the first founding account executive straight out of college. That was roughly 7-8 years ago now. And going from really just SaaS sales at a small tech startup, doing everything and seeing that expansion into going from 1 to 2 to 5 to 10 million in ARR, and how the team grew from a marketing perspective and understanding, the importance of social proof throughout that whole process is what led me to where I am today and the founding of Proofmap. Before I actually got into that, though, yes, you're right. After I left Cloud Coach, I traveled the world for 8 months with my girlfriend. I definitely, before that, we had moved around so many times. I was this guy that was never going to get locked down. And sure enough, you travel the world for 8 months, you come back, and next thing you know, it's like, I want to start a company. Let's get married. Let's actually live. We moved to Austin, Texas. And yeah, so the last 6 months, really the story of my life has been just really going all in, both in marriage and starting this company. So that's been exciting too. So I'll throw that in there as well.
Well, tell me a little bit about Proofmap, why you're all in, because that leads right into the conversation that we're going to have here today.
Sure. Yeah, I think when I actually had come back from my trip, I think I had this longing to be an entrepreneur. And I probably spent a lot of time exploring all these grandiose ideas and what could I do with AI, and or what would just be an easy business to start, or maybe entrepreneurship through acquisition. And I think probably a month and a half of doing that and getting nowhere, my wife, Bree, she just kind of looked at me and was like, what about something that you're just naturally good at, something that you actually have experience in, which seems so obvious, but when you're in the mix and trying to start a business, things like that can kind of go over your head. So for me, it was always selling software, particularly B2B enterprise. That was my whole career, but doing it in a very authentic and credible and trustworthy way. That was why I had success. I was always perhaps a little insecure about being a quote unquote sales rep, right? And dealing with sort of the, I guess just the skepticism that comes with when you're meeting an account executive, and the lack of trust, and trying to just cut through that as quickly as possible. And I did a pretty good job, and we can talk about that and the success I had there at Cloud Coach, which was the company I was at before. So then with Proofmap, it was about, okay, how can we actually replicate that? So it's not just individuals, but with companies that need to do that at scale. And that's our ultimate goal, which is how can we utilize social proof, which I think is really your greatest source of credibility with your prospects, and incorporate that across your entire go-to-market.
So, there's an underlying message underneath all of this, which is how important trust is for organizations. Our brands are trust marks, right? And if you look outwardly, Edelman and LinkedIn, they do a trust index, and it's just worldwide. In the US especially, it's been going down. I think it's down 10 percentage points over the last decade. There was actually a study that was done just over a year ago called the Trust Gap. And it found that of B2B buyers, 74% of them, they don't trust the customer evidence we present to them. So it's typically in the sales environment, a lot of it, or, we put together case studies and testimonials and all kinds of things. But if three quarters are not buying what we're saying about, hey, here's the value we create for our clients, and we could do this for you, what kind of trust do we have? Right. And
Right.
how do we operate in that environment? So that's where I was really intrigued by, what you're doing at Proofmap here. Tell me a little bit more about social proof, how you're using it, how it can be leveraged so that everyone in the company can gain trust and gain the transparency that we want to have on how we can help.
Sure. Well, and let's take a step back too, as far as that trust gap study. Um, as far as like, why is that such a major challenge for B2B? And I'm going to speak on behalf of more so B2B, particularly enterprise B2B. SaaS is the world that I live in, but B2B, let's say. And I mean, it's not a surprise, right? I didn't know that exact figure, but it's not a surprise at all because there's just so much noise out there right now. And it's getting cheaper and cheaper to get into everyone's inboxes and their feeds. And I'm not going to curse on this show, but there's just a lot of BS out there. And thus, like, you can't use a lot of those traditional methods, particularly when it comes to your outreach or outbound marketing that you could before. And that's created a lot of really resentment, probably, particularly with B2B. So cutting through that noise is certainly a challenge. And then I think specifically within the enterprise space, more so than ever, like, you have to pass the baton so many times now as well within an evaluation cycle to different people within the organizations, different systems. And so, like, in the past, even early in my career, it was me from the very beginning that I was the first person that did the maybe even the cold call, and then the discovery, and then leading on through 3 to 6 months evaluation process. So I was pretty comfortable that I could create trust as a person, human to human being. But now there's all these complex systems involved, and especially on the marketing side, as companies grow, you're trying to maintain trust from what's that first ad that a client sees on a LinkedIn feed, to who's actually talking to them on the phone in a cold call, to who's doing the discovery meeting, to then who's actually engaging during the sales cycle, who's doing the demonstration, who gets involved in the latter stages if it's something where you got to actually get more consultants involved or integration partners involved. So now you just have, now you're having to create trust systematically versus just like a human being that can cut through that and have their own specific tactics for how they can gain trust. So I think that's why it's particularly a huge challenge. And so you really got to start top down to create it.
Well, what's interesting, Neil, we talked about you just got recently married. My wife and I got married a long time ago, but one of the things that we said is if we don't have trust in our relationship, we don't have a relationship.
Right.
And B2B is a relationship driven business. You just talked about like a 6 month sales cycle. I mean, there can easily go 12 months, 18 months. I mean, there are very long sales cycles in B2B and ABM. And so if we don't have trust, I mean, it sounds like you made it individually for you. That was your number one goal, was to
Right.
build trust and transparency, like your number one goal. So how does this now kind of turn around, and how does content, you talked about social proof, the title of this episode is The Missed Opportunity of Creating Content at Scale. Like, where does content come in, and how does it play, and how are we not doing it right?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I think as far as where we're falling short, like, for example, like a big aspect of what we do at Proofmap is we outsource essentially your customer interviews. So we interview our customers' clients, and we get to know them, and we conduct a full-on interview, and we're very thoughtful about the questions we're asking because we're trying to get real answers that will serve more than just one case study that on your website, which is really just serving like a single moment within that buyer journey. So when we think about content as it relates to social proof, we look at that as wasted potential because, well, one, I mean, you get an hour of your client's time, singing your praises. Like, there's so much you can get out of that. Even that initial interview, with that in mind, we can be more thoughtful about what is something that's going to be a really good snippet that's going to be serving more as like a 20-second awareness themed video, or what's going to be a great quote that's going to be good for something static that just gets some attention across LinkedIn or Facebook. But then also, how do we expand on that? Now, once you're retargeting and somebody's shown some interest and you actually want to get them with something a little bit more engaging that addresses a specific challenge that a persona might have, how can we also get that from that same initial interview with that client? And if you do it the right way, you can get all of this stuff. But if you go in just single pane of glass and you're just looking, we just want to get a basic case study on our website. Here's the before, here's the after, here are some superficial metrics, that nobody really buys into anyway. And we're good. And it's a waste. That's the way we look at it. So we expand on that much further.
Well, I have to tell you how much I love this, right? Because, you think about like that trust gap survey, right? And it was about the customer evidence that we present as a B2B company. The vast majority of that is case studies, right? And case studies usually, they're hard to get. There's not really anything in it for the client. And they're like, well, I like you guys. So yeah, I'll do this. And so, you've talked to them. And so internally then at the company, we write it up. It goes through a number of rounds. We send it over. It goes through a number of rounds. It goes up for approval. And if it ever comes back, which about 4 out of 5 don't, it looks like the most perfect, polished PR piece. And it's not them talking. It's 100% text, right? There's a testimonial here, over there. You're not hearing their voice. You're not seeing facial, interactions and body language, intonation, all that stuff, right? So when you talk about doing these kind of case studies, to me, that's like the case study wave of the future. And when you get somebody on the phone, there's like about 1 million things you can ask them and you can do with that content. So there's just my first takeaway already. We're halfway through the podcast, right? But I think what you're saying is, if I'm reading between the lines, we're doing it wrong right now. We're doing these case studies wrong as an industry.
Sure. Not only that, I think people would be surprised what you can get out of your customers. And there's a lot of assumptions that are made, and I've seen that too. And there are some challenge there that makes sense. Like I'm not necessarily surprised that this is something that our industry is struggling with. I mean, when you think of case studies, that's probably a content marketer, somebody on the team that might own that. And this is somebody that probably, has never engaged with the client before. This might be somebody that wasn't involved with the actual evaluation process. So there's a lot of insight on that front that could be useful for that before and after. I think Proofmap is unique because, I have a background overseeing a marketing team, but I'm primarily a sales rep. So I was very customer facing. So as we're going about producing a lot of this content too, there's a lot of insight into how is this actually going to be utilized to drive conversation, based off of what questions people are asking in the discovery versus what they're going to be inquiring about with a broader audience in a demo. Like there's a lot of nuance there that just like somebody that's just a content marketer that's just been told, create a case study, go talk to customer X. They're just not going to know what exactly we want to get out of that. I mean, for example, if you go to your marketing team and you're just asking them to get like a cookie cutter case study, you might be dropping the ball on how could that case study be leveraged for like a sales slide, prior to a demo. And let's think about a demo. Like, okay, a demo is, at that moment, this is a post, in a enterprise SaaS sales cycle, you've had a discovery call and you've probably gone over, a handful of requirements, but ideally you've gone through a number of pain points. And if you have a good sales rep, they're going to be going through and understanding, what are your challenges? What are the impacts if you don't solve these challenges? Where are you trying to get to next year? Persona wise, like if I'm talking to a head of PS versus a consultant, there's a different objective there as far as like what they might be looking for. A consultant's thinking about, just ease of use and time entry versus a head of PS that's on the demo. They might be thinking about more so like reporting and how this is going to integrate with, revenue recognition. That's like one example, right? Already just in that example, like that needs to be a totally different case study depending on who's on that first demo. And so, in order to even have the intuition to have that content available, you got to understand that. And that's where we kind of come in. We're a marketing agency in the sense of, we are producing content, But we actually, a big part of our process is we work with companies prior to even beginning any production to understand sort of who is their ICP, what are the different personas that are involved, what are the general objections that come up during any stage of the sales cycle, so that we can start to sort of backfill all the necessary content that's going to really match all those specific moments throughout that buying process.
I know, over the years, here's the typical objection. Our clients, they don't want to do case studies. Like
Right.
they're really hard to get a hold of. And, they don't want to say they're outsourcing this aspect of their business or why they're using somebody like us. They don't want to even approach that, right? I'm sure you've heard all the objections. Why this isn't going to work for us, right? Why it's really hard to get a hold of our clients. And what do you say to that? Because that's a very real objection. It's a very real perception, right? That yeah, that's a good idea, Andy, but it just wouldn't really work for us.
Yeah, well, I would say more so the objection that we hear is just more so like getting customers to agree to these case studies to begin with. And in that world, actually, outsourcing has been a way to overcome that. Like I look at it as if a customer is gonna if a customer is gonna give you feedback, and particularly feedback that's going to be utilized for marketing, they're doing you a huge favor. They're giving you their time. You have to really show them how much you value their time. And if you say, hey, can you do a testimony for us? And here's one of our individual contributors on our marketing team that's going to set up a Zoom call, and you get a real cookie cutter list of questions. That's not a great way to show that you value their time and that you're trying to get the most out of what they're going to bring to that conversation. So oftentimes, when companies work with Proofmap, it's, hey, would you be willing to do a case study for us? Your perspective is super valuable. We actually invest in an outsource, customer story agency known as Proofmap to make sure that we get the most out of that conversation. They have procedures to make sure everything looks great, lighting's going to be good, you're going to look awesome, and they're going to produce a lot of fantastic content. Here's some of the other case studies we've done in the past. Another aspect we do with that too is we try to offer some mutual benefit to your stakeholders, right? So if a customer is coming on to give you an interview, it doesn't take a lot of extra effort to also take some time to just cover just thought leadership on their behalf. So, if we have an hour conversation with one of our customers, we might spend like 30 to 45 minutes really getting into just trying to get those taglines, just trying to get them to say, how much they love, Acme, and, how much retention has shot up since they've implemented the platform. Yeah, of course we're going to get that stuff. But then we do spend a good portion of that conversation, and we come into this very thoughtfully with, hey, you've been a head of customer success within, SaaS, within the SaaS industry for 20 years. I've noticed you've worked at not just this company, but this company, this company. What are the biggest trends you're noticing going into 2025? What are you thinking about with this new AI revolution? And people love having those types of conversations. And it's just a brain dump. And even if it's totally agnostic to the platform or the solution that we're doing this case study on behalf, it's still valuable in the sense of you can celebrate your customers, you can share their thought leadership on your website, they can get notoriety on LinkedIn, they could promote their own self-brand, and it takes a fraction of extra effort, right? So that's another way that you can sort of overcome that.
Yeah, it's a good point because we all know that we have our own personal brands. We all know that we need to build our network. We need to build our notoriety, our own awareness, right? So it plays into that for sure. So uh, tell me a little bit about, because the title was all about, scaling content. What's the scaling portion of this conversation? So obviously you're going to make a lot of use out of it, right? Is that your point, that basically an hour long video, audio, transcripts, articles can be written? Is it that there's just this explosion of content that could come out of this in addition to a case study, or what is your point about scale?
Yeah, with scale for me, like having been formerly a VP of sales and marketing, scaling was always, and I'll even get more specific. I was a VP of sales and marketing at a bootstrap company. So scaling wasn't just about how much more can we spend on advertising? It was looking at a funnel, and it was looking at with the pipeline that we have, how can we close more? And that's where, through that perspective, we're trying to take social proof. I actually named my company Proofmap with that sort of in mind. I don't think I've been able to really in my marketing make it so obvious yet, but really like your social proof mapping across your entire customer journey. So when we're thinking about, okay, how can we do better job from getting to, the consideration to decision phase, then what's all the necessary social proof content that we know? Perhaps, a lot of times it is anecdotally to start, but we know that if we can get more social proof, if we can actually have better conversations in that demo, we can actually increase conversion rate across this stage of the sales pipeline, across this stage of the marketing funnel. And that's what I really think about when it comes to how you can better scale with social proof. So I think a lot of times people are creating case studies and it's really just checking a box. And there is an aspect of social proof that is that, that's where I kind of differentiate, social proof in the B2B space with B2C. You're looking at a product, you see that they have good reviews, you read one quote, you hit purchase. That's all you need. That's social proof at work, and that's great. Whereas in the enterprise space, that same experience might just be what allowed you to say, learn more and click demo. So we have to expand past that. What's the social proof you're going to use on an outbound discovery call when you have a 24-year-old rep, representing your company, and they're trying to convince somebody that agreed to take a 15-minute meeting to jump on a demo. We can think about that. And once you start doing that across every stage of your pipeline, that's where you can start to 2-3x your closed revenue by the end of the year.
So here's what I'm wondering is, with all of this authentic content that's extraordinarily well thought out, like you made a comment earlier that impacts the entire go-to-market strategy.
Right.
So it's not just a PDF. It's not just a YouTube video, right? It's not just an email. When you said it affects the entire go-to-market strategy, explain that, because it's a big statement. And I think I'm following you right away, and I'm thinking all the ways in my own head, but I'd love to hear you articulate a little bit more about that, because the go-to-market plan needs trust infused in it at every single turn. The issue of trust isn't just the AE, on trying to get a demo or on a call. It's the entire organization. So I'm just wondering what you're thinking behind that.
Yeah, well, let's think about the chicken and the egg when it comes to what your ICP is, right? You can decide what your ICP is, and that's what you do with all your marketing. And as companies grow and product marketing becomes a thing, you start to define that. Or it's you find out what your ICP is because you have happy customers within a segment. And that's where, the more customer conversations you have, which if you're going to have those conversations, let's try to, work with Proofmap so we can actually leverage it for content. So one anecdote, one of our customers that we work with, they have a software platform for procurement and RFP management. And, at the time that we started working with them, you go to their website and they're kind of all over the place as far as use cases, big and small, different industries. But a real objective from their CEO was, I have a hunch that I think our product's really, really effective for sort of small consultancies that do outsourced security and reporting. But there was this premise, or I guess this theory that, we think we could have a lot of success in this space. We only have a handful of customers, but the implementations are going really smooth. They're really happy. They're adding on, and they're renewing. And so that turned into, okay, well, let's look at that as, let's invest in customer content from them and have more conversations with those customers. And then that will start to get peppered across your go-to-market, and we'll start to see how that's doing across your audiences, in the awareness stage of your funnel, and how prospects are engaging with that. And as they start to work with your team that is now more enabled with social proof content throughout that entire engagement. And that's what's really driving, a real shift in their go-to-market strategy. So that's one example. But as you can see, once you're thinking big picture, there's a lot of different ways.
So, I have one last question. I think it's probably the hardest. Okay, because we've talked about a lot here.
Sure.
Here's that question. If there was just a single takeaway that you wanted people to remember from the entire conversation here, you said, if you take anything away, take this away from this conversation. What would that be?
Yeah. There's a few. But I think never make assumptions as far as what your customers, think or feel about your product or your service. Talk to them directly. I think that's something that I've been surprised about, even in my past life, at my prior company. But then especially now where we interview our customers, clients on their behalf. And it's kind of, we're uniquely positioned to learn a lot because, like we're a third party. So they can be a little bit more transparent with us, as far as what they actually care about. And we find that not only are we creating great material for our clients to leverage for their marketing, but we're also giving them a lot of great insight. And, for example, part of our process is before we do any interview, we have a sort of like a pre-customer interview, like discovery call. We have an interview with our customer before we actually interview them. We go to Acme and we take like, who's your stakeholder that's most familiar with this customer? And we just talk to them. And what was the sales process like? What products are they using the most? What do you think they're going to say? What are the metrics you think that they're going to come back to you with? And that gives us a pretty good game plan as far as how we want to attack the interview. But then I would say 50% of the time, the customer wants to take it a totally different direction. And sometimes they'll even, I'll ask a question that was, something that was, really like just kind of hand given to me, like, really, this is going to be important. Talk about this. And I'll ask it and it just falls flat. And it's actually not what they care about at all. And they hear like, yeah, I guess, technically, yeah, we've had a 20% increase on that, so-and-so metric, but I don't even know what the industry standard is. And that's not really what I'm getting graded upon as far as like how I get promoted. So you can learn more by actually talking with them. And thus comes this sort of this cycle is like, how does that then need to sort of correlate with your upstream marketing? And then of course, there's a whole other side of this from just a product management standpoint where, just talking to your customers, there's so much you can get out of it. And if you're not doing that, I think that's a huge problem. And, so if you're the CEO, how many sales calls are you actually sitting in on? How many QBRs are you actually present with? How many customer interviews are you doing yourself? I'd like to think that, any leader at a software organization should have a quota of as far as how many customer conversations they're having on a monthly basis.
So that's interesting. I like that. There was a woman that came onto the podcast, and she's a 3-time B2B CMO. She's also a value accelerator advisor for Goldman Sachs. And she said, here, Steve, is one of the most impactful, important questions that I think we should be asking of our customers. And it was this: what do we do for you? Because we know, right? We know what we do for our clients. We know the value we give them. We think about it every single day. But what made me say this was what you just mentioned there is like, what we think is the most important thing sometimes isn't. And we have to be open to what is it? How are you deriving value? And let's listen. And sometimes hearing that's not really the most important thing. Sometimes that's hard to hear because we put a lot of time and effort in product development and sales enablement and marketing materials. And we're like, oh, hang on a second, right? But they're the ones that are speaking the truth. They're the voice of highest authority in our business. So that's my number one takeaway from everything you've been saying here is we got to talk to our customers and we got to be open to learn.
Right. Yeah, I think what we do for you, if I were to just add something else on top of that, is there's kind of two layers to you, right? Like, what do we do for your organization? And then there's what do we do for you, like you personally, stakeholder that I'm talking to right now. Because that's something I learned too as a sales rep. Like once I was able to break past like, oh, I'm dealing with so-and-so And, you know, we're all human beings. So as much as we want to, as much as the top line, of our company is super important for, a sales leader, at the end of the day, they're hoping to get a promotion. They're trying to look good, for, oh yeah, it's my 1 year, and I got to make, a big impact, and I got a deadline, and I got these new resources that I'm trying to hire. And so like what we do for you can go even a layer deeper on a personal level. And that can also be reflected on your marketing. It might not be what you'd want. And this is where, by having multiple, layers to social proof, yeah, like perhaps that's not what you would lead with on your website, on your case study. Got so-and-so a promotion and they increased their LinkedIn following, by 2,000. That might not be what you have for your case study on the website, but that might be something that's really useful as like just collateral, or just even something that sales reps can be equipped with as far as how they can communicate with their prospects. And so we can go even deeper.
Well, I know one thing for sure is that there's going to be additional questions. Would it be appropriate if I gave out a link to your LinkedIn profile that people could reach out to you?
Yes. Yeah, of course. Yep. It's just going to be, Andy Stauffer. So you can find me.
Great. Well, the whole goal here is to bring in different ideas, different perspectives from C-suite individuals, and they get us to think different about how we can create success in our businesses. And I think you did that today. So I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for that job.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks for having me.